This has probably been one of the years where I've had the fewest questions and calls about insect problems in canola. Part of that probably is the lower acreage that we've had for a long time, but also just looking at this crop here, it's an extremely clean crop this year. Do want to mention a few things about insect control. The last couple years I've worked with Josh to get a handle on the idea of when Roundup applications go out to add pyrethroid insecticide, and at least in terms of the yield response and data that we've had, it's been kind of a wash. It isn't something that we can count on having a benefit or not having a benefit each year. And I always like to point out with a group 3 pyrethroid insecticide, we do have 2 pests that are commonly found in canola that are also pretty well known to be resistant to pyrethroids in different populations around the world. So I don't always encourage just an automatic application of a pyrethroid if you don't have a reason to be using it at the time. It's imperative for aphid control that we use a seed treatment. That is a given. That has to happen, or else we could just end up having all kinds of problems. But what we found, over the years with some of the research, is that insecticide application that's placed on the seed delays any aphid buildup through the fall, so that if we're going to have to deal with aphids, it'll be in the spring as the plants start coming out of dormancy. Aphid control at that point in time is complicated too, because one of the most effective products we have to control aphids has some very strict guidelines on when it can be applied because of pollinator protection. If you look at a label on a group 4 insecticide, it'll say it can only be applied after petal fall. So then the question becomes, what do you do if you have aphids before petal fall? And there's really not a whole lot of options available there. But one option we do have is a product called carbine or Belief. And some education has to happen when using that product too, because when it's applied, the way it works on an aphid, it's called a quarter tonal paralyzer. So it paralyzes the muscles on the mouth parts of that aphid so that it can't feed anymore. And so it starves to death. They don't just drop on the ground and die. They're there kind of crawling around. They probably even produce a few young for a little while, that when they take their first try and bite the plant that's been treated, then their mouth parts also become paralyzed. So over the course of time, they're going to die, and even after that application is made, those aphids quit feeding. They can't feed anymore, but they're still around, and if you go out and think you're going to be seeing a clean crop with no aphids in it, it's not going to happen. But the neat thing about that product, there's a couple of beneficial things about that product. One is that it can be applied at any time. The label doesn't have a restriction on when it can be applied for aphid control. And we've also looked at some research over the course of the last few years where we know that if you have natural enemies out there that like to feed on aphids, they can eat those aphids without any detrimental effect to them. So if you got a lot of lady beetles out there eating those aphids that have been treated, it's not going to hurt them. They're going to be fine. So you're getting the benefit of the insecticide stopping those aphids from feeding, and not having an impact like you would have with the pyrethroid insecticide. It's just going to wipe everything out. We also know that when we use that product like that, where the aphids stop feeding but they're still around, it turns out that stopping that feeding adds the benefit of yield protection. you do get better yield response, even though it doesn't look like you're getting very good control of the aphids right away. But at the end of the year, when the harvester comes through, it works. It protects yield and it does a better job for aphids. We also have products for Diamondback moth, which is another insect that has quite a potential to be resistant or very difficult to control with pyrethroids at times. We have some products that are available that do a very nice job with it when it is a problem. But again, it's going to cost some money. Prevathon is an expensive product to use, but it works great on Diamondback moth. So insect control in this crop is a little bit complicated, but the tools are there for the most part to be able to manage insect problems when they come through. Just have to be a little more aware of the restrictions that you have on some of the labels for some of the products, and the idea that we do have green peach aphid and Diamondback moth, that if anywhere around the world where any kind of brassica is grown, whether it's cabbage, broccoli, or canola or things like that, resistance shows up in some of those populations. So it's just something you have to be aware of. And I guess to end my talk, the good news is this year, it seems to be kind of a worry-free crop in terms of insect problems right now, which was really good because last year wasn't the case at all. Plus you had the compounding of lack of moisture and everything else.
I think that's primarily due to the acre reduction.
There may be something to do with that. What I've noticed with Diamondback moth anyway, in drier years it seems like they build up a little better, especially drier falls. And they're going through the winter. If you have a mild winter, they can survive through the winter pretty well too. I think I'd just be watching, from my standpoint, watch the crop right now. Because when I've seen real problems develop, it would be now, and there would be hundreds. I mean, they would really be building up, and not seeing that right now. So, might not have any problem at all. Just depends on how long it takes for, things to... Yeah, it's the worms that do the damage. And, if you really want to find out, sometimes they're kind of hard to see, so you might want to just get a dish pan, a square dish pan, and beat on some of the plants to see how many actually drop off. If you get 10 to 15 per plant or something like that, definitely need to probably do something about it. If you look at a class 4 insecticide, which would be like a Transform or any of those products, if you look on the label, it says you can only apply after petal fall. There's no restriction on having seed treatment on the crop, but any foliar applications where they have the restriction on not being able to apply before petal drop, and that's just due to the bee, the pollinator things. Not just the commercial beekeepers, but native pollinators too. That's what they're concerned about with those. Any of the people that market those products had to go and redo their labels so that they had the pollinator protection restrictions on them, or else they weren't going to be able to sell them. It's a false chinch bug that really likes this crop. The regular, here we're getting into what I like to call entomology nerdish. There's a chinch bug, and then there's the false chinch bug. The false chinch bug likes this crop. The chinch bug likes this crop. And they're two different things. The false chinch bug is going to feed on seedling crops when they're coming up, and they'll get into soybeans, they'll get into sorghum. Later on in the year, you might see them getting into sorghum heads pretty severely. And they build up in this crop, and then they have to find something else to feed on. They're not really injuring the soybean in terms of having any kind of toxin in their saliva, but they just suck the moisture right out of it when they get in there. If you want to protect that crop, you better be watching for them. They're not necessarily, there's not a guarantee that they're going to come in, but you need to be watching for them. A year like this, with all the moisture we've had, I guess I'd be kind of surprised if we're going to have false chinch bug issues this year. They kind of like drier weather. So I'll keep my fingers crossed. Yeah, if you're trying to double crop into the residue there, they're just probably going to sit there and wait on it. So I guess if you saw the ground covered with them, I'd probably do a pre-treatment spray before you even plant. You know, if you're seeing a lot of activity there, I'd control them before you even put something in the ground. And probably a lot of the ones that you would have in that field at harvest are going to be still immature, not be able to fly as adults. So you'd be able to get rid of a lot of them at that. Under dry conditions, they're hard to control with a lot of stuff. I mean, you know, we've seen them get into even alfalfa where we couldn't control them because on a dry year, you know, it was really dry. You just couldn't control them that well.